cominciare? Okay. Grazie. I'd like to mention, my name is John Harper, by the way. I'd like to mention, first of all, that this event is part of the Patrick McCarthy Memorial Series on intellectuals and politics. And for those of you who don't know who Patrick was, many of you probably don't, Patrick was a brilliant and observer and scholar of contemporary French and Italian politics and literature. He was originally a student of literature. And he was also a beloved and admired teacher and colleague here for many years. I think starting in the late 1980s until his retirement around 2003, 2004. And I urge you to go down, if you haven't noticed, on the second floor, there's a Patrick McCarthy Memorial Classroom. Take a look. And there's a wonderful portrait of Patrick. It really captures his character, I think. It was done by a distinguished Bolognese artist by the name of Maurizio Osti. And so go have a look at that. Our guest of honor, of course, today is Professor Mark Gilbert. And Mark is the Seagrove Haines Professor and Professor of History and International Studies here in Bologna. Mark studied at Durham University and got his PhD from the University of Wales. Before SAIS, he taught at a number of places, including the University of Trento, which is actually where he lives, University of Bath. He did a stint in Pennsylvania, the home state of Seagrove Haines, by the way, as well as yours truly. And if you're from Pennsylvania, I urge you to register to vote. I'm not going to tell you who to vote for, of course, I wouldn't dare to do that. But Mark did a stint at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania. Mark is a prolific author. His books include The Italian Revolution, The End of Politics, Italian Style, ? European Integration, A Concise History, Cold War Europe, The Politics of a Contested Continent, as well as the Lega Nord and the Northern Question in Italian Politics, which he did together with Anna Cento-Bull. And he's the editor, the co-editor of the Historical Dictionary of Modern Italy, which I'm sure you'll find in the reference section of our library. Right, Gil? Okay. And he did that together with Sarah Lamberti Moneta. And we're here, of course, to talk about and discuss Mark's latest book, which is the culmination of a long career studying modern Italy. And there it is. It's actually, this is the, I guess this is the British hard copy, published by Penguin and Alan Lane. And it's also, Alan Lane is a new print of Penguin. It's coming out simultaneously in the United States. Correct, published by Norton, a very distinguished commercial publisher, W.W. Norton. Last but not least, there is an Italian translation, which I think is coming out simultaneously, published by Rizzoli. That's really a tour de force of publishing. You have to explain to us how you managed to do that all at the same time, Mark. In any case, we're looking forward to hearing from Mark. He's going to present the book himself. And then we're going to hear from our distinguished commentator. I'll rapidly introduce our old friend and colleague, David Ellwood. David is also a distinguished scholar. Let's start with the most important things. He's an alumnus of the Bologna Center class of 1971, am I correct?
172.
And 72. And he's also was professor, associate professor, now retired, of international history at the University of Bologna, a longtime adjunct professor here at the Bologna Center until this past year. He's the author of L'Alleato Nemico, The Allied Enemy. Interesting, no? La politica dell'occupazione anglo-americana in Italia, which came out with Feltrinelli in 1977, is a basic source for anyone studying the occupation of Italy. I read it, I cut my teeth on it. Mark, I'm sure, used it when he began studying this subject. It was published in English, or some version of it. It was Italy, 1943-45. He also wrote a book on post-war reconstruction, rebuilding Europe, America, and Western European reconstruction. Last but not least, his magnum opus, think it's fair to say, The Shock of America. Europe and the Challenge of the Century, published by Oxford University Press. So I'm going to stop there. I'm going to turn it over to you. I think we have, I guess you can take, since it's your book, you can take as much time as you want. Give us a little time.
How much time have you got? That's the question.
Well, when people start walking out.
Yeah.
Yeah, we can carry on in the bar if we don't finish it.
Well, first of all, really, thank you all for coming. SAIS, as John has just hinted, has got a long history of studying Italy. We're here in Italy, and so much of modern scholarship on contemporary Italy in particular has been generated by scholars in this building. In addition to John and David, John very modestly didn't mention his own book on America's role in the reconstruction of Italy, but also David with his work on Italy 1943-1945, which is still the best book, I think, on the Allied, inverted commas, occupation of Italy. But also, you know, Patrino, I don't know if he's here, Patrick McCarthy, who we've already been talking about, and I'd just like to add a little bit on my own account about Patrick McCarthy, because he's somebody whose books absolutely stimulated me to come to this place of Poland. And Vera Zamagni, who is sitting here at the front, who's taught me most of what I know about Italian economics, although I suspect I'd only get a B+ if I took an exam with her. It's not just the study of Italy, it's also the study of Western Europe. I think it's very important to study Western Europe here in SAIS, or Europe in general. Europe is changing. Europe, it doesn't mean we have to study Europe in the way we studied it in the 50s or 60s or 70s or 90s. It's changing, but we still have to study Europe. That's why we're here, or one of the main reasons why we're here. I think it's very hard actually to disassociate this center from contemporary Europe's history. It's, in its own small way, played rather an important part in this contemporary European history, certainly in commenting on this center's history. I suppose my book, in a way, is my own small contribution to this tradition, but I've got to admit that while I was writing the 550 pages of the English edition, 544 pages of the American edition, and 600 pages of the Italian edition, it didn't feel like a small book.
It's a very big one.
Yeah. It was also, most unusually for me, it was a book which was very largely archive-based, and in particular the archives of Christian democracy, and I wish I had done more. There is so much stuff to be found. The Italian Interior Minister's personal archive, Mario Scelba, is something that practically no one in English has ever looked at. I looked at it, but there's so much more you could find there. It was also compiled because of the pandemic in more solitude than usual. This really was my pandemic book. I didn't have the interaction with scholars. I was able, because Italian libraries perform miracles in keeping themselves open during the pandemic, once the worst months were open, but it was not possible to go to as many archive sources as I would have wanted. And it certainly wasn't possible to attend as many conferences and meet as many colleagues as I would have liked. But it did enable me to, the pandemic did enable me to reflect upon what I was doing. And that's perhaps why I wrote it so fast. I started writing seriously at the end of 2022 and completed it in February 24, which is a lot of work in a short time. I was very fortunate. John very kindly pointed out that it's a multi-publisher venture. I was very fortunate indeed to work at Penguin with a guy called Stuart Profit. I profited from his advice, so to speak. Stuart is, you know, he was Eric Hobsbawm's editor, David Canadine's editor, Alan Bullock's editor. It was a real education to work with him. I feel like I improved at least 20% by the end of the writing process. Also from the Italian edition, I had the Italian equivalent, a guy called Andrea Cani at Rizzoli. The book's genesis, just a few words, I'm just saying a few words about what started the whole thing. The book was inspired, unquestionably, by the referendum of 2016. And I mentioned this in the introduction to the book, because in 2016, Italy had to decide on whether to change its constitution. And this was 6 months after the frankly fairly farcical referendum in my own country, in Britain, which was not a model of democratic referendums, euphemism. Whereas the Italian referendum turned into a gigantic debate over the meaning of its democracy. Genuinely, I can still remember Professor Prozini, who unfortunately wasn't able to be here today, in a wine bar in Udine, talking to about 100 people about the fine points of the Constitution. And I remember thinking, and in the end, the Constitution was unchanged. The proposed changes were voted against 60-40 after what was a genuine exercise in deliberative democracy, in my opinion. And I remember thinking, well, maybe there's more to this Italian Republic than I have been used to thinking. And I started researching it and eventually got the book contract and writing it. And if I may, I'm just going to quote something I wrote. Back in 2016, Italians were aware that their nation was stagnant and in decline. They had to decide whether their circumstances merited overhauling the institutional structure put in place by the Republic's founding fathers. They decided not to by an unambiguous majority, but they thought about it hard. It was an impressive example of democratic maturity. One moreover that suggested that to grasp fully the complexities of Italy's present and future, one simply had to go back to the origins of its democracy and study the republic constructed after the fall of fascism. So I did, and this book is the outcome. Its argument, put simply, is that the resilience of Italian democracy was forged by the completeness of fascism's failure and by the democratic culture that was painstakingly acquired after 1945. Italy sank into an abyss of moral, military, and political humiliation between 1940 and 1945, but experienced a democratic apotheosis in the following 10 years. Its democratic miracle preceded the better-known economic miracle. Indeed, the country's economic transformation in the late 50s and 1960s simply would not have been possible had the democratic transition not taken place. Now, that was the starting point of the book. Can we move to the next slide, please? That was the starting point of the book, and that was the theme that I was trying to work to throughout the book. So I'm going to start by talking about fascism, talking about the fact that I would like to argue that Italy's never been a democracy. Now, and when I say Italy's never been a democracy, that makes no great claim. I think until after 1945, most European countries have never been democracies. I don't want to claim Italy was particularly exceptional from this point of view. If by democratic you mean countries in which there is a reasonable degree of equality between the citizens. Because in liberal Italy, so-called liberal Italy, there was not such equality. And then that system, the parliamentary system, which collapsed in World War I, was followed by fascism, which was not in any way democratic. Indeed, was quite explicitly anti-democratic, which is why the first chapter of my book is called Undemocratic Italy. And I learned a lot writing this book. And one of the first things that I learned, one of the most important things I learned while writing my book, was that fascism was really bad. It was absolutely horrible. Now, some of you are going to say, well, you know, great, we all know that. But do you really? I think the common representation of someone like Mussolini, for example, very often is that he was a buffoon, a poser, that it was all show. And there was an element of truth in that. A lot of it was all show, but he was a thug. And he was Machiavellian, in the worst sense of that word. And the regime was contemptuous of its own people. It brought the country into disaster by siding with the Nazis and fighting on the side of the Nazis, betraying countries which perhaps ought to have been its allies. It dragged Italy into the abyss. And it did this with the support and enthusiasm of the traditional elites of the country, the royal family, the leading industrialists, the top civil servants, the top journalists, the political class of the country, in short, supported the fascist regime really until the summer of 1943. And then they overthrew him and then subsequently ran away. Sorry to be so blunt, but it's the truth. Italy had the humiliation in September 1943, when Italy changed sides in the war, of being militarily smashed, but also leaderless. It had been it was transformed into a battleground, the Germans against the Allies, against the United Nations. We often forget this because I think in most wartime representations of the war in Italy, we think of the Americans and perhaps the British, but in fact the British were the British, the Americans, but also the Commonwealth nations, Poland, and even Brazil. Brazil had a division fighting in Italy, if you can believe that. The North was commanded by Mussolini after it had been rescued by the Germans, the so-called Repubblica di Salò, the Italian Social Republic. The South was controlled by the Allies, and David is the most distinguished scholar of that period. Only after June 1944 is a government of the Committee of National Liberation, of the political parties that have been suppressed by fascism, allowed to emerge. I want to underline this because we can now say it. For many years, you weren't allowed to say there was a civil war in Italy, but there was a civil war in Italy. There was a civil war between the resistance, the political parties, the democratic political parties, and the Italian Social Republic. And it was a terrible civil war. The Italian Social Republic's the history of the Italian Social Republic is it's an infamous history. It was anti-Semitic. It deported Italy's Jews. Its police forces and squads killed thousands upon thousands of people with the most appalling and barbaric tortures. They fought a dirty war against their own people. And that's why the heroes of this story, so to speak, are the political parties which emerge, that are hidden in churches, in secret in Rome. The leaders which emerge, the people who lead the resistance in Milan and Turin, other cities of the north. I'm oversimplifying here. Somebody's written, could you please take down the main slide so we can see the panelists better? I don't know what we do with that. And I think my previous slide, if you can just go back to that, to the fascist thing. I just want to underline this point about the Civil War. Fascism destroys democracy before the war. It then destroys the Italian state during the war and by its alliance with Hitler. It doesn't destroy the Italian people. And these scenes are the famous scenes from Piazzale Loreto in Milan, 29th of April, 1945, when the dead bodies of the fascist hierarchs are basically pummeled, defiled by the crowds that gathered, because they were dumped in this square, they were urinated on, they were spat on, they were, one woman shot 5 bullets into Mussolini's body. I always thought that was an urban myth, but apparently it's true. And then they were strung up from a petrol station, as you can see by their heels. This was an Italian historian that said this was a people that was venting its wrath at having been tricked for 20 years by this regime. So that's what the first part of the book is about. It's very short, first 4 or 5 chapters is the descent into the abyss, but then they come out. And the parties, the political parties, lead them out. We can now look at the next slide. And the principal parties being Christian Democracy, the Communist Party, Socialist Party, the Action Party, which is an intellectuals party, the Liberals and the Republicans. And they bring about a somewhat miraculous constitutional compromise. They basically cooperate from 1943 to the end of 1947 to forge a constitutional compromise, which I would argue is based on 5 key precepts. And I'm not going into all the details of the referendum and the various votes. I'm trying to give you the big picture, and we can talk about details. What are the 5 principles underpinning the Italian constitutional compromise? First of all, it's republican, not monarchist. There was a referendum on the monarchy, 2nd of June 1946. The Republic wins, and thank goodness it did, because there would have been civil war if it hadn't. I do not believe that the Communist Party, in fact, very clearly, if you read the minutes of the Council of Ministers, you see very clearly that both the Socialist Party and the Communist Party would never have accepted losing that vote. It was formed as a republic. It was progressive. Those of you who are not Italian here probably never heard the first article of the Italian Constitution. Italy is a democratic republic founded on labor. And the idea that there will be progressive social rights and the rights of workers, that rights would be extended to everybody, to the humble workers, the mill hands, to the people working in the ports, to the factory hands, to the women who are working in housewives working in the slums of Naples. They're all going to get the rights. This is the fundamental premise of the Italian Constitution. It's going to be a Catholic republic. The Italian state, the Italian Constitution recognized the country as being Catholic, and that the Catholic Church was part and parcel of the constitutional order. It was going to be anti-fascist in 2 ways. First of all, fascism was banned completely. Everything that had to do with the fascist state was overturned by the principles of the Constitution, which is not so much about the principles of legality as much as legalism. The defense of the individual in the articles of the Constitution against arbitrary behavior by the state is absolutely overwhelming. Now, all of these were ambitions, so to speak, at the time, but nevertheless, they're there. Last but not least, Italy was not going to have a duce again. It was going to have a state that was not particularly strong. Decision-making would be taken by consensus, not by strong majorities and institutions. There would be a proportional representation system. I personally believe this was a mistake, and we could even talk about that if any of you don't. But I'd just like to look at this picture that I've put up here to also underline a point about this constitution, this constitutional compromise. Who are these people? It's a great picture from this point of view, from my point of view, as somebody who's trying to make this argument. On the left, Alcide de Gasperi, the leader of the Christian Democracy Party, beyond any argument, the protagonist of my book. The reviewer in the Times said I wrote a love letter to de Gasperi. This was not fair. A civil servant who must be what, 36, 37, something like that. So almost certainly he had started his career in the fascist state. Probably isn't a fascist, but nevertheless, he probably had. Interim president Di Nicola, a Neapolitan grandee, a member of the Royal Senate. In many ways, a bit of an emblem of the state that had coexisted alongside the fascist state. He'd also been a critic of the fascist state, but in a very accommodating kind of way. Next person going across, Giuseppe Grassi, who was a liberal and an aristocrat. And last but not least, Umberto Terracini, who was a communist, president of the Constituent Assembly, the strongest anti-fascist within the Communist Party, the strongest anti-Stalinist within the Communist Party leadership, and not incidentally, and I don't bring up his religious affiliation for no reason, Jewish. So you have a Jewish communist who's agreeing to a state in which the Catholic Church is embodied as the principal religion, is part of the Constitution. You have a liberal aristocrat who's, I could go on. You see the point. There is a compromise here between different groups across the society in these democratic principles. Slide number 4, please. Now, even before the Constitution was signed at the end of December 1947, it comes into force on the 1st of January 1948, cooperation between the parties had ceased. It had ceased on everything except finishing off the Constitution. In May 1947, de Gasperi, who had been well informed by Italy's brilliant ambassador in Washington that the Marshall Plan was on its way, or something similar to it, Alberto Tacchiani he was called, forces the Communist Party and the Socialists out of the government. Because he knew that the Americans would look askance at having to deal with a communist and socialist in the Italian government and give lots of money, and it could hamper Italy's money, which Italy desperately needed for reconstruction. And I'm sure Vera is going to bring this up in the discussion. I'm not going into the economics here deliberately. De Gasperi says, De Gasperi is there on his own. De Gasperi, uomo solo, as his daughter said in a book about him. He told he by sheer force of personality persuades the Christian Democrats, we must do this. He says, either we do it now or we'll never do it. Yeah. Now, the communists, by contrast, are placed with an enormous dilemma in the summer of 1947. They were rather like the Czech communists. They actually wanted the Marshall Plan. They quite explicitly come up with an economic plan in the spring of 1947, which was, in effect, assuming that the Americans were going to give Italy money. But of course, Stalin said no to that in the summer of 1947. And when Stalin said no, the Italian Communist Party shifted line and turned into a violent critic of the government and followed a very confrontational policy with the government. Within the meetings, the only person who dissented was the man I have already shown you, Umberto Erratini, who was subjected to a kind of, the documents are fascinating. He's basically sitting there alone in the direzione or steering committee of the Communist Party. Everybody's attacking him for his lack of commitment to the Stalinist cause. He's the only one that's saying this is not our original policy was better. What we've been doing, cooperating with the other parties. Okay, now Cold War democracy in Italy. What happens? To cut 150 pages of my book down to 2 minutes. De Gasperi basically follows a policy rather like Konrad Adenauer in Germany, Westpolitik, Adenauer calls it. Occidentalizzazione, you could call it in Italian if you wanted to. And what does that mean? One, he joins NATO, anchors himself in the American post-war military construction. Two, Christian Democrats cast Italy. There's some wonderful work by Italian scholars just recently on this aspect. Cast Italy as being an essential part of, inverted commas, the West, which is what we're inventing at this time, as an ideological opposition to the East, i.e. communism. And finally, and probably most important of all, Italy makes the choice for Europe and commits itself to joining the nascent institutions of European cooperation. And that is why, even today, when people think that Giorgia Meloni is going to become a fascist, one is forgetting that the Italian state rests on two gigantic, very strong pillars. A, the Constitution, B, its commitment to European integration. No? These are very brave choices because they meant radical changes, for example, in Italy's economic model. Professor Zamani knows far better than I do, in the early 1950s, under the economic management of Ugo Lamalfa, Italy cuts tariffs further and farther than any other single country in Europe. And as a result, and at the same time, Luigi Einaudi, who is first president of the Bank of Italy, then finance minister, and then president of the Republic, Italy follows an incredibly strong lira policy, which ensures that the Italian lira is not devalued until the 70s. Yeah? This is a strong, almost inverted commas, Germanic policy. And it works. But it was a very brave thing to do in the circumstances of Italy in 1948, even with Marshall Plan aid arriving. So what did the Communist Party do? The Communists opposed NATO. the debate over joining NATO is 324 stenographic pages of the parliamentary debates, and there's a riot breaks out while it's going on. It propagandizes for Moscow and the Russian model, and it opposes European unity tooth and nail, particularly the so-called European defense community. You can imagine Italy's democracy, Italy's Cold War democracy, is characterized by fierce, this kind of political polarization inevitably leads to violence in the streets and to political polarization in the streets. Italy is a very violent democracy in these first few years because it's so politically polarized. Maybe some of the Americans present might be seeing something similar not too soon. Okay, slide 5, everybody. Now, that's the Cold War democracy. I can't go into everything. Great man history, what an old-fashioned phrase, but I'm not quite sure what else I should call it. It's very unfashionable to talk of great man history. It's out of date. I myself admit to having only completed 12/13 of the book because I really, really wanted to have a long chapter, longer even than the Cold War chapter, on how Italians live their democracy, the social history of the Italian democracy, but the book was already 170,000 words long and nobody would let me write it anymore. But I found it, as the book went on, I found it quite impossible not to focus on De Gasperi and Togliatti in the latter parts of the book. This is in part commercial. You've got to personalize things, right? Those of you, if you ever go on to write books, you really can't write for pages and pages if you hope that somebody's going to publish, a commercial publisher is going to publish it, about the fine points of the debates between between Gronchi and Gonella within the Christian Democrat leadership. You have to personalize, you have to pick on people. And I do think that De Gasperi's, but I'm making a broader point here, which my book really underlined, I think, which is the role of agency in the process of democratization. I don't think there were many structures driving Italy to democracy. I think it was something constructed by political decision-making. And again, if I may just quote something at length, you won't understand all the details of this, but I hope the point will be clear. On 10th of June, 1953, Andreotti recorded the Premier, De Gasperi, saying that the electoral law was the first time I've been wrong since the war ended. This sounds arrogant, but the Premier's record on the hard decisions of his premiership backed his words. He had ousted the ineffectual Ferruccio Parri as Premier, opted for the Republic, compelled the king to step down after 2 June 1946, made peace with Austria, made a dignified protest against the peace treaty, wooed the Americans in January 1947, ended governmental cooperation with the PCE in May 1947, backed Einaudi to restore sound money, sought Marshall Plan aid, fought the PCI passionately in April 1948, the great elections, which we can talk about, but respected the constitutional rights of that party thereafter, joined the Atlantic Alliance in April 1949, implemented land reforms, stood firm against Vatican pressure to ally with the undemocratic far right, and had committed Italy to being an integral part of the process of constructing greater West European economic and political cooperation. One need only envisage what might have happened in Italy had De Gasperi failed to make even one of those calls to see how much his agency had mattered for the transition to democracy. I think the only other person in the DC leadership that would have made all those calls was the Interior Minister, Mario Scelba, who was widely perceived as an authoritarian and didn't command the same position within the society. Without De Gasperi, I don't think those calls would have been made. Now, it's an important point. But Togliatti too, slightly against my will, because I'm not exactly an admirer of the Italian Communist Party, but I have to say, without Togliatti's interventions too, I'm not sure Italy could have become a democracy. He was a moderating force within the Communist Party. There were plenty of people who were in favor of insurrection. He was not. He made the constitutional settlement possible, quite literally, by going into the parliament without even warning his own side. In fact, 1 or 2 communists voted against it by, I think more by accident than anything else, by saying, church, okay, Christian Democrats, you can have your settlement on the church, provided we have our settlement on the social republic, on the republic being socially driven. And he followed a middle course between people like Perugini within the leadership of the Communist Party who were anti-Stalinist and people like a man called Pietro Secchia who was, died in the wool. Most of the party were died in the wool Stalinists. And yet at the same time, this is a man with an unconditional loyalty to Moscow. And yet he manages to keep the Communist Party within what Italians call the constitutional arc. There was nobody in the DC who had the stature to follow the policies de Gasperi implemented. Apart from de Gasperi, there was nobody within the PCE with Togliatti's authority to follow a parliamentary strategy within Italy. I think they were both Machiavellian. De Gasperi was a man of virtù, those of you who read Machiavelli. He was a good man of high principles who could be absolutely ruthless when it was necessary. In the 1948 election campaign, they started off with a kind of pact of good behavior. De Gasperi rips it up after the Soviet coup in Prague and fights the dirty, low politics campaign against the communists. He's determined to win. Togliatti was a cynic, I think. He outmaneuvered everybody, even Stalin. And if you like, I'll explain why I said that. But he unquestionably viewed the world through the lens of the party ideology and had absorbed that cynicism at the heart of the Stalinist experience, whereby people could become enemies of the people from one day to another. So last slide, I hope I've not been too long in talking too long. A vibrant democracy, not a perfect one, sorry, it's De Gasperi's last government, he did 8 governments between 1945, December 45 and August 1953, fell in August 1953 after an election that was fought over the legge truffa. There have been some people who have said that that Italy was a state that was tending in an authoritarian direction by 1953. I don't think so. I really don't. And it was something I was totally undecided about until I started researching this, because there are some very good scholars who have argued it. And look at the public participation in the electoral process. The rallies were gigantic. De Gasperi and Togliatti and Nenni, who was the leader of the socialists, would speak to 100,000 people. That's why my book has the crowd on the front, which is a rally of one of Nenni's comizi. 94% of the people voted in the June 1953 elections. 94%. It's the highest vote in a democratic election in the post-war period. Entire streets were papered with propaganda, as you can see there, right? I mean, that's just one house. You can see there are photos of it. Entire streets are plastered from head to foot with propaganda. There was a vigorous political debate. It's not true that there was, yes, to some extent, there was still some legacies of fascist law, for example, which was sometimes applied by the police. But the Communist Party published 50, 60 publications. Millions of copies every day were being published. There was an incredible intellectual ferment, if I may say so. If I can just bring in some cultural history, which is one of the things which is missing in the book, but it won't be the next book I write. It's no accident that 1950s are years of astonishing cultural production. This is a country that by 1959, Antonioni's L'Avventura is being published, is being shown on the screens of cinemas. It's a country, a genuine intellectual ferment. The very poor were still very numerous, but the political miracle was about to give birth to the economic miracle, and you would have even communist workers driving to the party meetings in Via Cinquecento. Indeed, it was a necessary precursor for it. And if I can just conclude, if I may say so, with a sentence which I was actually rather proud of. I hope that doesn't sound immodest, but seriously.
Plenty you can be proud of, Mark.
Thank you. It's hard to imagine what a history of post-war Italy with the politics left out would look like. Such a history would deprive the Italian people of a large part of their identity. The people were not mere voices off in the political struggle, nor did they appear only in crowd scenes as extras. They were the raw material of politics, the clay that enabled the vase to be recast. If the vase has never since broken irreparably, despite some very hard usage, particularly in the 1970s, it's because the clay is good and the craftsman of the original potters was outstanding. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. Just a footnote before I pass it to David. Explain what this picture is. I mean, it's meant to capture something essential. Where is it? When was it taken? And what does it represent?
The photo was it's a park view.
I don't know if you can all see it.
The photo is a park view of a electoral campaign in 1948 electoral campaign meeting being addressed by Pietro Nenni, the Socialist Party leader, and we chose it. Or so the art editor of Penguin tells me, but yeah, I wouldn't have thought of it, but it seems pretty good. On the one hand, you have the dark, and on the other hand, you have the light. And this was the idea of the art editor, which I thought was quite nice.
Thank you very much. David, over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Mark. It's an honor to be here. It's an outstanding occasion. The last person to be published by Penguin, last English-Italian specialist published by Penguin, Paul Ginsberg in 1990. So it really is an exceptional privilege when an Italian specialist in English is published by Penguin in this fashion. And when you read the book, you can see all its features, all its attractions. Why am I here? Why am I in this position? I came to Italy by chance. And the chance is the Bologna Center. The fact that Bologna Center is in Italy was the sign of my destiny. If it had been in Norway or Belgium or Greece or anywhere, everything would have been different. Everything would have been different. I got here not knowing a single word of Italian, not having the slightest interest in this country. And then I came along and had this epiphany on the corner of Via Zamboni and Via Zambitale, and everything changed from that moment on. I was the first person to do a second year in the Bologna Center, and it was Grove Haines, who was still in charge, wanted to begin a process in which the Bologna Center could issue its own MAs, and I was one of the first guinea pigs. There were two of us, and we shared a tiny scholarship, which meant I had to teach English and do all kinds of humble things to get going. But it was in the spring of '71 I invented this PhD thesis about the Allies in Italy in World War II. I don't know where I got the inspiration from, that doesn't matter. But that was what I knew. I wanted to do a PhD thesis. I wanted to do a full-time research. And that was the idea. It was going to be the politics of the war in Italy. I'm not an Italy specialist, reality. What I'm really interested in, the red thread which goes through all my work, is a history of the function of American power in all its forms in contemporary European history. That's what I'm interested in. And the more I've gone on, the more I'm convinced that the forms which are really penetrating, really impactful, really enduring, are in fact cultural. And that's why I ended up teaching a course on soft power until this spring. The latest example, of course, is artificial intelligence, which I take as a cultural phenomenon as much as technology. Anyway, that's another story. Anyway, I made this discovery about what had happened in Italy during the war. I was surrounded by people who lived through it, of course, here in Bologna. I spent 6 years on this PhD. I did the archives in Washington, the archives in London. But most of the time I was in Italy. Eventually, the whole project got taken up by the network of Resistance History Institutes. There's one in Bologna, the Pari Institute. The national one is in Milan, and the one where I found the most sympathy and support was in Turin, which is why in many ways, why I come to be still living in Turin. I've gone back to Turin. Finished the thesis in '77, which was done for the Special Italian Research Unit in the University of Reading in Britain. It was immediately published as a book in Italy, as John mentioned, and I was offered a job in the University of Bologna, which I immediately took up. The book had a very unfortunate title. It was called L'Alleato Nemico, the enemy ally.
Why? I thought it was a great time.
Because, well, let's say maybe you misunderstood it as well.
All these years.
And it's called the subtitle was La politica dell'occupazione alleata in Italia. Everybody thought by enemy ally I was talking about what the bad things the Allies did to Italy. The enemy ally was Italy. The enemy ally was because it had changed sides in this extremely egregious and invidious fashion, somehow slithered from being entirely fascist, pro-Nazi, suddenly, without any warning, it had become almost a member of the United Nations. An enemy ally. The Brits in particular, but also the French and many others, was extremist maneuver. The whole thing reminds me of a phrase in that great book, Behemoth, by Franz Neumann, 1942, Jewish German historian in exile, wrote the first major treatise of the practice and functioning of the Nazi state, 1942. And in this book, at a certain point, a German general is speaking from the 1930s, and he's asked about what about Italy, and he said, you can be sure that whatever side the Italians start on in the war, they will end up on the winning side. And that impulse and the kind of extreme cynicism, extreme skepticism toward the way Italy behaved in the Italian system, the international system, carried on all the way through to the peace treaty, which I'll come to in a minute. As I say, I finished the PhD. I was offered a job in the University of Bologna history department. And the significant thing about that history department, it was new. Teaching contemporary history was unknown until the 1970s in the Italian university. You couldn't taught contemporary history. It was not taught in high schools. I'm sure the theory remembers this. It was not taught. I don't know, when you stopped in 1915 or maybe 1914. You couldn't talk about contemporary history in Italian school system. You couldn't talk about it in the Italian university system. But it was a conquest of the 1960s that a course on contemporary history could be offered in the universities, and Bologna was one of the first. Of course, when I got there, I discovered the people, very smart people indeed. They're all steeped in contemporary history. They've done a lot of work on the Second World War, on the resistance. They were connected to the Resistance Institute in Bologna. Some of them were connected also to the Communist Party through the Istituto Gramsci, because the party had its own research and think tank, which still exists, the Istituto Gramsci, and several of them worked that I got involved in all that as well. So there was a constant reappraisal of what happened in the war and post-war period, especially in the 1970s, 1960s and 70s. The post-war generation wanted to challenge all established orthodoxies. This process is much more painful and dramatic in Germany, by the way, even more than in France. But nevertheless, it went on here. So a huge debate opened up about the meaning of the resistance, what the choices made by the Communist Party. Of course, the extreme left said they wasted an opportunity. The far left, because the party was under severe attack from its left in those years. In fact, when I started in Bologna, my job was suspended for a year. The university was closed in 1977 because there was a student revolt, a massive student revolt, and it was a revolt against the Bolognese establishment, which meant the Communist Party in Municipio and in the university. So the far left was a very powerful force at that time, or looked like it. Unfortunately, A part of it went underground and turned into the Red Brigades. And they had a very dark and terrible history, which included assassinations. Assassinated two of my colleagues, Roberto Rufilli in the 1980s and Marco Biaggi in 2002, who actually taught here. He was a labor law specialist. And just to say that the way the past is never past in this country. 50 years later, a trial against one of the Red Brigade's members for assassination began last week in Chile, 50 years on. Anyway, so contemporary history was very much on the agenda, and everybody started talking about the resistant institutes. Bologna was full of lively political debate. It wasn't just the far left, it was a whole spectrum of positions, all more or less critical of what the PG had done, what it represented. And of course, it was critical of the relationship with Moscow, because one thing that united that far left was anti-imperialism. This was the epoch of the birth of a new kind of what was then called Third Worldism. And that meant they were critical not just of the Americans and the European empires, but also of the PG's, the Communist Party's relationship with Moscow. Moscow was seen likely to be an empire, an imperialist power. So all that was extremely stimulating. You know, to discover a communist city, come from provincial Britain and then you find yourself in the middle. It's extraordinary. It wasn't just a city council, it was an entire way of life. It was an entire system. It was an entire regime, to call it with another word. I mean, some of its remnants are still around. Unipol, which is a major bank and insurance company, was then part of the communist system. They had their own hotel, they had their own catering organization, they had their own insurance company, all this kind of stuff. Some of this is still around. What was ignored, apart from what I said about Moscow in this whole debate, was the international context. Nobody really seriously studied the Cold War in its own terms. Or, I mean, everybody was against the war in Vietnam. That was taken for granted. Actually, think about Italy in the international context. That was part of the picture, which has now been magnificently reconstructed by Mark. So that's my own personal experience. The 70s were terrible years in Italy. Let's not forget. 3 attempts at coup d'etat from the far right. The assassination of Marco by the Red Brigades in 1978. The Bologna station bombing in 1980. These were terrible, terrible years. Nothing has ever been like it since, thank God. Thank goodness. Let me get to it. Meanwhile, I was burrowing away in the archives, and I had this extraordinary advantage that 30 years later, according to the rules of the archives in those books still exists, yet the documents from World War II were coming out for public examination. 1973, 43, 73, this flood of documents coming out about the war in Italy. And I was able to enjoy all the archives of the Foreign Office, and especially the archives of the Allied military government. But what the Allies established when they got here, after the surrender in 1943, was a sort of a military government. What then happened was that went on for on and on, because the war in Italy took much longer than anybody expected. And that had all kinds of ramifications, including the consolidation of this alternative post-fascist political network, the political committee, this party political committee. And they would have taken to actually create governments under the auspices of the Allies and then organize the transition in one way or another. Mark puts the Allies, the Anglo-Americans, very much in the background. I put them in the foreground because they were the ones who held the whip. They had the knife by the handle. And they had invented this extremely ambiguous concept to manage to define this relationship strategically, legally, politically. And that concept was co-belligerency. Co-belligerency. Co-belligerency was in fact the term which had united the US to the Allied effort in World War I, the Entente effort in World War I. It resurrected this occasion by the supreme political wizard of the whole picture on the Allies. It was Harold Macmillan, who was the political advisor to the Supreme Allied Command. He was the sharpest mind around. by considerable margin, not by chance. He went to a very successful political career in Britain, became Prime Minister in the 1950s. Anyway, colloquial agency was the supreme kind of umbrella concept which held everything together, more or less. Let me just move on quickly to the structure of the book, and I want to say a couple of words about method. The book is a giant synthesis. And anyone who's written a book of synthesis, which I have done, knows just how much mental effort goes into a work of synthesis. It's much more fun to work on archives and to put down the archives, one document after another, and describe what's in the archives. Synthesizing other people's stuff, whether it's from the epoch or from it's new, or whether it's just from 10 years ago, takes a lot of mental effort. It's more and more tiring than what you do, right? So hats off to Mark for writing this grand synthesis. Each of these phases has its own big historiography.
I can just say, I was about 60 when I started writing it. I'm 81 now.
Where does that leave me? I just want to say a word or two about method at this point. There are 4 features of the method which I think which are worth pointing out. It's a narrative. It is a narrative. And the last page or so, Mark quotes a very once famous British historian, A.J.P. Taylor, who was the doyen of international history in Britain, in Oxford, many, many years. He came to my university and I asked him in public, do you have a method? He just laughed and said, of course not. I just want to know what happened and how. This is that kind of book, up to a point. It's a what happened next and how book. So where does that leave the why? Why did this happen? In Mark's answer, in Mark's book, the answer is simple. The men, they're all men. They're all men. These people, what he calls agency, this trendy word he's talking about nowadays. I think we'll be with it for the rest of our days, agency. These men made the difference. These men did the piloting. These individuals. Of course, there are a lot of other individuals as well, not just De Gasperi and Togliatti and Nenni. These are the 3 great protagonists, and various other people who flit in and out of the story. There are surprises. I mean, De Gasperi is the hero, is the great hero of this, and Mark, I think, is explaining extremely why. It's not a love story. It's not a love letter to De Gasperi. It's silly. It is nevertheless extraordinary highlighting of his many attributes and extraordinary conquests. He could be nasty, as Mark pointed. He could be extremely ruthless. But that's what you need if you want to be a top-level political leader. You have to have a killer instinct. Brits will remember the famous Yes Minister episode when he becomes Prime Minister. He told the candidate has to have a killer instinct. De Gasperi had the killer instinct, no question about it. He was extremely ruthless, and he had no hesitation in deploying the armed violence of the armed force of the state when he thought it was necessary. Togliatti is profoundly ambiguous, obviously extremely smart, extremely able, extremely cultured. And he did survive. It is still amazing that he survived the great purges of the 1930s in the Stalin epoch. It certainly does emerge from the book that Stalin did have a kind of grudging respect for De Gasperi. And I think they both realized that there was a force in Italy which would always be bigger than them, the Catholic Church. Stalin could sit in Moscow as long as he liked, but the Pope was right there in Rome. That was a big difference. You say there are 2 churches, but that is a big difference between them. The Pope was right there in Rome. And he was not simply he pushed De Gasperi in all kinds of moments, in all kinds of situations. He also thought De Gasperi is not going right wing enough, not going rightwards enough. There's a whole story there which is absolutely fascinating. I agree totally with Mark that Nenni is the great enigma. He led a big party which did have a mass base, the Socialist Party, for many, many years. And you can forget that now. I actually had to go on to Wikipedia to find what actually happened to the Socialist Party. Because it was running the country in the 1980s. Craxi, this major political figure, was prime minister 2 or 3 times. One forgets these numbers. And then suddenly the whole thing was collapsed under the weight of the corruption. They just pushed corruption beyond any kind of tolerable limit, and they blew it up. I'll tell you a story afterwards if you don't believe that. Anyway, they blew themselves up. They blew up the whole post-war system, and the Socialist Party was dissolved by its members, what remained of its members, in 1994. Actually, officially dissolved, and since then it's never been seen again. So I agree. What did Lenny think he was doing? Because one thing I didn't understand till I read the book was that he also had his traffics with Stalin. He got the Stalin Peace Prize. He went to Moscow. He talked with Stalin. He had all kinds of pro-Soviet impulses and behaviors. And then, of course, that didn't work. Didn't work in 1948 in the Great Election. Didn't work in the years following. Then, of course, came 1956. And it all blew up. But he was a charismatic figure. He was a political leader with undoubted force and ability and charisma. He was ever present. Let me just, there are just 1 or 2 questions that I would like to come out of the book, which I would like to bring up. What do you make of co-belligerency from the wartime? What do you think the impact of co-belligerency was on the way that post-war democracy came out of the great disaster? Second point. The question of Italy's place in the international system. You give great importance to the choice for Europe. My argument is the choice of Europe comes out of a tremendous sense of vulnerability. Co-belligerency meant the total suspension of sovereignty. And after the war, given the fascism boosted autarky, we had the supreme nation, a conception of sovereignty which was absolutely over the top. The other extreme, humiliation, subalternity, dependence, physical dependence on outside assistance, persistent sense of tremendous sense of vulnerability. And I think that too meant Europe, or anything going, any alliance going, including NATO, obviously. You didn't get into the United Nations in 1955. The Brits didn't want Italy in NATO or the United Nations. The second point which comes out of the war is pacifism. I think you're the only person who's confirmed my impression that when it comes to pacifism, there's nothing really moral about it. It's simply just hate war, hate the reality of war, like we don't want to know about cancer, we don't want to know about sewage, we don't want to know about war, doesn't want to know what the causes are, don't want to know what the positions are, what the principles are. Everyone believes that it betrays their principles anyways. And so pacifism, we're against all wars. I'm don't interested in the causes or what's at stake. The other point about what comes after the war is the peace conference. There's only one new book or recent book on the peace conference, which I think was a major moment. Peace conference went on at the same time as the Constituent Assembly. And I wonder what attention the Constituent Assembly paid to the international context. That doesn't come out in the book. The peace conference showed Italy overwhelmed by enormous resentments left by fascism. Everybody who got invaded by fascism, even pre-fascism, wanted to take out their grievances on Italy on that occasion, punish Italy. They weren't interested at all in the difference between fascist Italy and anti-fascist Italy. Nobody was interested. The French, the Russians, the Greeks, the Yugoslavs, the Libyans, the Ethiopians, the Somalis, the Albanians, everybody had it in for Italy. And De Gasperi had to stand up there and says, I'm not apologizing for anything. He didn't say it in so many words. But there's a quote here which I want to read. This is from Churchill. It's not in the book. It's from Churchill. He said, Churchill came to Rome on 2 or 3 occasions during the war, after the liberation of Rome, obviously. And at one point, he said, he gave a public lecture on the nature and practice of liberal democracy and gave a stern reminder, quote, when a nation has allowed itself to fall into a tyrannical regime, it cannot be absolved from the faults due to the guilt of that regime. And naturally, we cannot forget the circumstances of Mussolini's attack on France and Great Britain when we were at our weakest, and people that thought that Britain should sink forever, which in fact she has not done. I mean, if you apply that rule to authoritarian regimes around the world, there'd be no end to the recriminations and procedures. Nevertheless, I think you underestimate the weight of resentment against Italy, shared by all these nations all around, which had been attacked by fascism, and the fact they were not going to forget or forgive, much less forgive. I think you underestimate that. Finally, next point, the Cold War, just a couple more points, the Cold War. Italy becomes a key battleground in the Cold War. There's a great fear of civil war. There really is a great fear of civil war that they were part of the Communist Party will rise up. So there's extreme, there's a quote here, I won't read it out. There's extreme disillusionment among huge parts, especially the North, working class people taken by the resistance, aboard the resistance, against the way things were working out. Everything concentrated in Rome, politically apart. Nothing democratic about what was happening. The whole thing was fixed from above. Giant sense of resentment and bewilderment. All that effort and all that fighting, all that sacrifice, and not produced right away a much more radical settlement. And at one point, the insurrectionary part of the Communist Party took over the prefecture in Milan. They actually occupied the prefect's building in Milan. And the leader of this movement rang up Togliatti and said, this is what I've done. And Togliatti replied, a great quote, bravo, what are you going to do with it? So that, in a certain sense, that made it clear that insurrection was not on the agenda at all. And this came clearer and clearer after 1948, after the episode when Togliatti was shot, was almost killed by an assassin, who later, 50 years later, said, I wish I had killed him. You do mention that. Yeah. He did not repent, no sense of how to plead it. Nevertheless, there really was, and of course, as you do list, there was a huge collection of underground weaponry, massive collections of underground weaponry, which could have fought an insurrection. And so all that atmosphere and all these realities certainly are worth reevoking. The gasping between left and right. It's one thing we generally underestimate, the weight of the far right after the war. You do bring that out very well. Reborn Fascist Party, Neo-Fascist Party, and the Uomo Qualunque Party, which is the precursor of all the populism we see around today. And they put on a lot of pressure, and they were supported by the church. The church comes out of this story very badly. They were supported in their fashion, trying to push the diaspora into moving much further right than he actually did. And I think that's a worthwhile point. Neo-fascists today do not apologize for any of that at all. In fact, many of them repudiating anti-fascism would actually like to resurrect some of these impulses and some of these movements. The Italian story is a classic case of when states make nations, I think, when states make nations. And obviously the collection is the Constitution itself. This is an extraordinary construction. It's miraculous. You need to see how difficult it is to get anything decided through Parliament, through any Parliament in this country at any time. The fact that this was built, that it was constructed, that it was sophisticated, that it was enduring is truly extraordinary. In today's newspaper, this is the stamp of the Turin National Daily. This is a review of a new book, brand new book by former president of the Constitutional Court, Giovanni Maria Flick, who's obviously legal specialist. And he's explaining what the Constitution means today and what it means for Italy's future and why it's significant. Facing the challenges of technology, facing the challenges of artificial intelligence, facing the environmental challenge, the Constitution will work. It's been adapted, continues to be adapted, and still a fundamental reference, our fundamental reference point, the link between state and nation. So finally, oh, sorry. Okay, right. I was going to say three big questions which were sovereignty, identity, modernity. Each of these will require discussion of its own, which we leave to the discussion.
We have 15 minutes at least. Should we start? I see a hand right here. I guess you should, if you could identify yourself.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm a second year Maya student doing 2 years in Bologna, actually. And I was curious about Italian remembrance culture. So you mentioned that you learned how terrible fascism was, and Professor Ellwood spoke a little bit about teaching contemporary Italian history in Bologna. And as a German living in Italy for some years now, also before the election of the current government, I think it's quite obvious that there's differences in how the two countries approach remembrance culture overall. So I was wondering if you could speak about Italian remembrance culture, if there is such a thing, if that's needed to protect the democracy that your book speaks about, and if you have the time, maybe even speaking a little bit about the difference between the North and the Mezzogiorno in that regard.
Shall we elect a few, Mark?
Yeah, I think.
Okay, Vera, I'm sure you have.
Well, I'm very glad that the book is out because we had lots of discussions with Mark on various aspects of it. And I only have one small contribution, which is the following: to try and understand why democracy had a success after the Second World War, in spite of the fact that fascism was what it was, as you said. You might be correct in saying that democracy did not exist in Italy before the period after the Second War, but civil society existed in Italy before. And civil society was quite strong in universities, in associations, in journals, in even politics, you know, because the Socialist Party was in power, not in power, but I mean was in parliament before the First World War and also after. The Popular Party was born before fascism, and the Popular Party is, of course, the anticipation of the Christian democracy. Alcide de Gasperi was a member of the Popular Party, of course. And even the Communist Party was born before, in 1921, Gramsci and many others. So elaboration of ideas, of suggestion. I have also worked with Constitution from a certain point of view. I published an article recently on this. And you can say that the intervention by people who were present in the Constitution, most of them had even 3 degrees, university degrees. And therefore they knew what we were saying and what they were proposing. And I think that this is the reason why then the Italian Constitution remains strong even today.
Any more? See your hand right here. Sorry, I'm not seeing all the hands, but I do see your hand.
Is it mine? Dr. Gilbert, my question is for you. I was wondering if I could just touch base on one part of your book where you discuss the murder of Togliatti, and you yes, that's correct. My apologies. But you mentioned that the individual that attempted to murder him remained standing, towering over him. To me, it was somewhat of a foreshadowing to some of what the panelists had had mentioned, which would come down in the future of the anni-detenzione, Aldo Moro, the political violence, all the way up to what occurs under the years of Berlusconi, for example. But so my question is, to the Italophiles and the Italian citizens that read your book, is it more of a cautionary tale towards the future, or an ode to optimism?
Mark, I think we should give it back to you. It's your
Thank you.
lot on your plate.
Well, a lot on my plate. First of all, I'd like to thank David, and I'll just go through his points very quickly, and then I'll answer the 3 questions. Then maybe if we have time, we'll have another giro. Yeah, it is a giant synthesis, but not only, one of the things I did try to do was try to integrate not so much contemporary academic literature, although of course I've read an awful lot of it, but try to integrate what people were saying at the time, and try and recreate the mentality of the people that were taking part in the events that I was describing, which brings me to my second point about narrative. David pointed out I'm a fan of A.J.P. Taylor, no? And he says that A.J.P. Taylor famously says that history is distinguished from other forms of human inquiry by virtue of the fact it deals with things that come one after the other. And there's an element of that which I've never really got over. I think narrative is a wonderful thing to do, because you have to construct a giant clockwork mechanism in which everything fits together. And although everything comes one after the other, the art of narrative is knowing when to take something out of chronological order. And I hope I managed to do that in the book. I think narrative is a great explanatory tool, because you're not there saying X happened because of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 causes. You're showing how those 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 126 causes emerged to make things happen. And I think from this point of view, I am an unashamed narrative historian, because I think it enables you to bring out the sheer complexity of what happens. And I think it also drives you, and this is David's point, towards understanding how much the agents, how much the political leaders of the time really did matter as a result of that. It's very hard, if you're taking a narrative approach, not to understand how much certain decisions at certain moments mattered. And my goal in the book was to try and show the precariousness of everything that was happening in Italy. The fact that so much, this process of democratization, we can call this a process of democratization if we like. I can only tell you it could have stopped being a process of democratization 110 times in the course of those 10 years that I'm describing after the war. It's a fact. Again and again and again, things could have gone wrong, and they didn't. And I think narrative is the best way of showing that. That would be my answer. Now, De Gaspery's ruthlessness, which David points out, a famous Italian liberal thinker called Piero Gobetti wrote after World War I that the problem with Italian statesmen after the Risorgimento had been they lacked the courage for the terribili doveri of creating a state. De Gaspery and his right-hand man Scelba didn't. And if that meant sending the police to go and bash people's heads, they did it. Now, that is a harsh thing to say. And people say, oh, well, shouldn't they have been good humanitarians? They didn't think so. And that's what I meant by saying De Gaspery was a realist. He was a realist, and he could be ruthless. I think the idea that some people have that he should be a saint is nonsense. On the other hand, I don't think that, as by now must be fairly clear, if he had fallen under a bus in 1947, I don't think Italy would have become a democracy. Now, co-belligerency, and more in general, Italy's place in the international system and its sense of vulnerability. I agree with everything you say, David, and I think it's true that I did put I was talking about the Italian leaders, so I put them foreground rather than to some extent the Italian context, but you're quite right to point out the international context. The Italians, it's an essential part of this sense of humiliation that the Italians had. They were absolutely convinced, or their political leaders were, that they had to re-establish themselves in the international system. And I think they had lost their sovereignty. They had lost their sovereignty in some ways more dramatically than anybody in Europe. And that's one of the reasons why I think they were open to talking to the idea of European integration. I think also they lost their empire. And David pointed out to me that you're being a bit British here, because I actually say at one point in my book, in a way that British historians can be terrible when writing about history, we can be a bit patronizing, but I didn't mean it in that way. They actually benefited from losing their colonies. Look at Britain's contemporary history. The fact that we had this gigantic empire and we had to live with what we had done and the costs, and frankly, we made a mess of it, if you want my opinion. Parenthesis. But the Italians, in a sense, had that taken away from them. They had to find a new role in the world. You know, Dean Acheson talking about Britain, it's lost its empire but hasn't found its role. The Italians lost its empire and found a role in Europe. And it was fundamental. I don't think you can take Europe out of the democratization of it. Pacifism, yeah. Article 11 of the Italian Constitution. Italy is a country which I think will always, always, always hate war because of the consequences of war that fascism brought to it. And I think it's a fundamental, and World War I indeed. And I think this is a fundamental part of the Italian political culture that's created, that enables the Italian democracy to survive and prosper after the war. No one was going to be violent. The peace conference thing, I'm not completely sure I do neglect the peace conference thing.
No, you don't.
But there's one thing that De Gasperi stands up in front of the peace conference and he silences the entire hall. Because as David said, everybody thought he would try and apologize. His own advisors advised him to apologize. He said, I'm not going to apologize. I was an anti-fascist, they put me in prison. There is a communist tradition in Italy. There's a worker tradition in Italy, socialist tradition in Italy. There's a Christian tradition in Italy. Fascism is just one of the things that came out of the Risorgimento. And I'm not apologizing for those of who resisted it. I'm not going to apologize for that. And he made a huge impact on the United States, as John can tell you more than me. Burns, the American Secretary of State, was very impressed by De Gasperi. And that's one of the reasons why De Gasperi subsequently gets
He's the only person in the room who shook his hand
Yeah.
when he left the hall.
Yeah.
The American Secretary.
Absolutely, yeah. So just to come to the questions from the floor, Italian remembrance culture, I don't think it's Italians precisely for what it followed on quite nicely to what I just said. I think Italians have never really come to terms with what the fascist state did, or not as well as they could have done. And the reason for that is precisely because the people who formed the democracy after the war genuinely felt they had nothing to do with it. I don't know how many Italians here agree with that, but that's my perception. De Gasperi does not regard himself as being in any way complicit with the fascist crimes. None of the people who have governed Italy since the post-war regard themselves as being implicated with fascism, which is why the arrival of Meloni in power is actually interesting. But I don't think it's problematic. We can go and talk about that another way. Now, Vera, your point, it was in the chapter I didn't write. And no, really, I mean that. That was one of the things I wanted to talk about, the civil associationism, perhaps particularly the corporative movement, and I'm not going to embarrass myself about talking about corporatism with you in the room. But this sense of civil society, which was able to nourish post-war democratic institutions, you're right, it goes back to the 1880s, Rerum Novarum, etc., no? And it was there was something to build upon, if there was a leader able to build upon it. This would be my point. Yeah. And last but not least, the attempted murder of Togliatti, does it anticipate subsequent violence? Is it a cautionary tale? I think that's a brilliant question, if I may say so. I think Italian democracy is, well, what I said at the end. I think it's vibrant. I think it's real. I think it's fragile. And I think that was true in 1948. It's still true today. It's an extraordinary democracy. It's a creative democracy. It's a much stronger democracy than many people give it credit for. But there is an undercurrent of violence. There is a tendency, and has been a tendency throughout the entire post-war period, for people to put political ends so to follow political ends, political ideologies so intensely that they're prepared to kill for it. Has that disappeared from the Italian character? No, I don't think so. I would only add that this is very widespread across Europe, which is perhaps why we're also worried about populist movements.
Did you answer her question about remembrance?
Yes. Yes, I think so.
Maybe we have time for one more, or one or two more. Yes.
And just a parent of students, but we're thrilled to be here. Thank you. This is wonderful. Questions for Professor Gilbert? You guys mentioned the role of the intelligentsia and Italian culture and democracy. Anybody in particular in Bologna who stands out as sort of one of the people who helped play that role? And also, I could be wrong, but it's my understanding fascism isn't actually illegal in Italy, just the fascist party. It is legal, so do you have concerns about that? Is that incomplete in the Constitution, or how do you do that?
Okay.
The last one.
All right, I'm Ian, I'm in Professor Gilbert's class, actually. So my question is on, so you mentioned that you viewed proportional representation in the initial constitution as like a mistake. I was wondering, like, because I think you have a rather positive analysis of, or optimistic analysis, I should say, on the formation of the modern Italian republic. I was wondering, what other mistakes do you think they made upon its foundation?
Well, I won't answer particularly about Bologna. On the back of my book, there's a quotation, there's a blurb. This was obviously not coerced in any way, shape or form. It's a very nice blurb by Elena Agarossi, who was a very famous Italian historian. And, but in private, she said to me, "Mark, where are the intellectuals?" And actually, they're not in the book, despite the fact, as my colleagues know, I regard myself in some ways as being an intellectual historian. I came to the conclusion, oddly enough, that the intellectuals who have mostly written the post-war history of Italy didn't matter as much as they thought they did. But the big parties mattered far more. Now, this is a really, really open to discussion argument. I'm quite certain when the Italian edition of the book comes out, there'll be lots of professors who go, "Where are the intellectuals? These British, they've got no idea of the importance of ideas." But I can only say it was a conscious choice, and I'm prepared to defend it. I think the intellectuals who were mostly on the centre, on the left, although there were some very interesting Christian Democratic intellectuals too, actually counted for less than they think they did, and less than the history books have argued that they did. That's a personal opinion. As far as fascism goes, now this is a really interesting question, and this was something I knew nothing about until I started studying this. The Shelby laws, which were passed in 1952, trying to put flesh on the constitutional provisions and make it completely clear that if you show any sign of adhesion or support to the symbols or ideas or political actions or apologies for the political actions of the fascist regime, you're going to prison pretty damn quick. These laws are quite draconian, and they had an enormous impact on the neo-fascist movement which emerged, which was the Movimento Sociale Italiano, which is the party that Giorgia Meloni comes from. This party quite explicitly sends out, I've read the document, sends out a letter to all its members. Whatever you do, don't start supporting the Duce in public, otherwise we're all going to prison. And the party manifesto for the 1953 elections, you read it and you have to kind of go through it, trying to figure out that it's actually a party of fascist inspiration. It comes across as if it was just basically a nationalist reactionary party, because they're very careful about the language that they use. So what the Italian state did in 1952, I should say, parenthesis, and we're running out of time, but just to be very quick, there is a bit of an idea that in 1953, with the so-called Legge Truffa, and it's very difficult for me to give you all the details on this, I think De Gasperi, this is me, I'm gonna write an article about this and see if I can prove it. I think De Gasperi was above all else in his policy in 1952-53. He wanted the electoral law primarily because he wanted to make sure the Christian Democrats were not dragged by the church into an alliance with the neo-fascists. And he wanted to have a strong majority in parliament for this reason. That's not the standard interpretation of why it happens. Tito is shaking his head, but I think but that's certainly the argument I would like to make, which actually brings me to proportional representation really rather nicely. Do I think it was a mistake? Yeah, a little bit, yes, because De Gasperi, after this terrible electoral battle, which was fought tooth and nail, no blow, every low blow imaginable in 1948, ends up with 48% of the vote. It's exactly the same as Attlee got in Britain in 1945. Attlee was able to transform the British state with a majority of 170. De Gasperi had to rely on the Social Democrats showing up in Parliament willing to vote for him in order to get something done. That's another reason why he wanted to change the electoral law. So I would be tempted to say a slightly more majoritarian, a reinforced form of proportional representation, such as currently exists in Germany, might not have been a bad idea. That's my opinion again. What other mistakes? Well, I'll tell you, for me, I don't know if it's a mistake, but I'll tell you something which I think is a big weakness of the book, and it's something David mentioned to finish. This is the Socialist Party and the role of Pietro Nenni. If anybody ever asks you, what do you think about Mark Gilbert's book? Well, you heard it from the author. I could not figure out Pietro Nenni. I couldn't figure out the Socialist Party, and they're trying to understand his role. And it was all very picturesque, and he's a wonderful man. I loved him by the end of it, but if you ask me to explain what he thought he was doing between 1945 and 1954, I'm afraid I've got to throw in the towel because I couldn't understand.
You're not the only one.
And I'm not the only one, yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.
It would be wonderful to have Patrick here to answer that question about the facts.
I feel sure he could answer it better than